She was humiliated in front of a full first-class cabin, publicly asked to prove she belonged there, denied service, and treated like a problem, all because of the color of her skin. No yelling, no violence, just quiet cruelty wrapped in politeness, the kind that knows how to smile while pushing you out. Passengers looked away. Crew whispered behind curtains. And she? She sat there, alone, holding a notebook they'd mocked, unaware that the woman they tried to erase had the power to end their entire career midair. You think this is just another flight story? Think again. This isn't about a bad service complaint. It's about what happens when quiet dignity meets systemic arrogance at 35,000 feet. We won't spoil who she really is yet. But trust us, when the truth lands, it hits harder than turbulence. If you're watching this, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. What would you do if this happened to you? And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because what happens next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and justice in the sky. Olivia Morgan moved with quiet confidence as she stepped onto the jet bridge leading to Flight 370. She'd spent the last week lecturing across 3 states, and now she was returning home, tired but composed. Her suitcase rolled behind her in perfect rhythm with her strides, her navy blue pantsuit pressed to perfection, her blouse crisp, her demeanor collected. Everything about her was polished and deliberate, but more than that, earned. She had booked her first-class seat weeks ago, specifically selecting 2A for the extra space and early disembarkation. As she approached the aircraft door, 2 flight attendants flanked the galley. One glanced at her boarding pass, then at her face, then again at the boarding pass. A subtle but telling pause. "Boarding pass again, please," the blonde asked, though the scanner had already beeped green. Olivia offered it without hesitation. The attendant's eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, handing it back with a rehearsed smile that didn't touch her eyes. Olivia nodded, her gaze cool but unreadable. As she entered the cabin, she felt the shift. First class wasn't just about extra legroom. It was a room that expected familiarity. The air was scented with lavender and leather. Polished surfaces reflected soft gold lighting. And the hush that followed money settled over everything. She located her seat with ease, placing her carry-on in the overhead, her briefcase tucked neatly beside her legs. As she sat, the row behind her fell into a soft hush. The man seated in 3C, white-haired and clutching a newspaper, muttered to his neighbor, "Didn't think they gave upgrades to just anyone." Olivia heard it. She didn't react. Not yet. She opened her notebook, leather-bound, sleek, filled with tight handwriting and annotation tabs, and resumed outlining her keynote presentation for next month's history symposium at Georgetown. A shadow passed again. The same blonde attendant hovered beside her seat. "Ma'am, would you mind confirming your seat number again?" she asked, already holding the manifest. 2A, Olivia replied evenly, not glancing up. "It's printed there." "Of course," the attendant murmured, then pivoted quickly and disappeared down the aisle. 2 rows back, a woman in pearls and an Hermes scarf leaned slightly to whisper something to her husband, then shot Olivia a quick glance, as if she'd been given a puzzle she didn't quite believe the answer to. A champagne tray came next. The woman in 1A got served first. Then 2B, a middle-aged man in business casual. Then 3A. Olivia, the only passenger, skipped. She didn't call attention to it. Instead, she reached for her pen and circled a phrase in her notebook: systemic erasure through soft aggression. She smirked. Fitting. A second attendant passed, this one younger, eyes darting nervously. She glanced at Olivia, then toward the galley. No greeting. No tray. No offer. Olivia leaned back and waited. The man in 2B suddenly rose and turned, making a point of removing his jacket in the aisle beside her. As he stuffed it overhead, his elbow swung too wide, brushing Olivia's shoulder without apology. She pulled in slightly, gaze still steady on her page. Another muttered comment trailed from behind, probably upgraded through some DI program. Olivia blinked slowly and inhaled, the exhale just long enough to steady her nerves. She closed her notebook and placed it squarely on her lap, resting her palms on top of it. Her ring caught the light, Harvard crest, class of 2004. The pilot made the pre-boarding announcement. As seat belts clicked and carry-on settled, a man in 4A coughed loudly, looked away, then looked away. The blonde attendant returned, crouched beside the man in 2B, and whispered something. He glanced at Olivia, smiled. Olivia caught the word mistake. The attendant stood and addressed Olivia with performative calm. There may be a seating reassignment. Would you mind stepping toward the galley for a moment? Olivia's head tilted slightly. Why? There's a question about the seating manifest. There's no question, Olivia said. You scanned me. You confirmed my seat. I'm sitting in it. The attendant's smile stiffened. It'll only take a moment. Olivia didn't move. I'm fine here, thank you. The attendant hesitated, then walked away without further argument. The overhead bins clicked shut. The plane was sealed. The lights dimmed. Yet as takeoff neared, tension clung to the air like static. The flight was 30 minutes in. The cabin settled at cruising altitude, and still no one had addressed her row directly. Her seatmate in 2B, a man in his early 50s wearing a pastel golf shirt and Rolex thicker than his wrist, had already received 2 refills of champagne and a bowl of warm almonds. A different flight attendant now, brunette older, with a tight smile and rushed movements, approached their row and bent down to offer him a second snack, this time truffle chips with sea salt. Olivia waited, expecting the same courtesy. Instead, the woman glanced at her tray table, which held only a glass of lukewarm water, and said, "Trash," without making eye contact. Before Olivia could respond, the attendant snatched the glass and coaster and disappeared down the aisle without a word. Her tray remained bare. Her call button, pressed nearly 10 minutes earlier, blinked softly above. No one came. She watched her seatmate smirk slightly as he leaned back, clearly enjoying the unspoken imbalance. Across the aisle, another passenger raised a glass and toasted softly with someone in 1C. The mood in the front of the plane was light, comfortable. Olivia, meanwhile, sat in a bubble of chilled civility, acknowledged only when convenient, addressed only when necessary. She tried pressing the call button again, her finger calm, deliberate. It blinked once, then twice. 5 more minutes passed. A new flight attendant, a tall man with sharp features and impeccable grooming, walked past her row with a tray of assorted wine bottles. He stopped at 1B, offered a tasting pour, and moved to 2B next. "Pinot or Syrah, sir?" The man in 2B laughed and gestured toward the darker bottle. "Syrah, of course." The attendant poured a generous glass, set it down gently, and then turned to Olivia. He didn't ask. He didn't offer. He didn't even glance. He simply moved on. Olivia let out a breath, slow and steady, then reached for her notebook again, flipping past the earlier pages to a fresh one. In the top corner she wrote, "Erasure in Service Industries, Field Notes." Her pen hovered over the page before jotting. "Selective hospitality is still hostility." She paused, listening to the hum of the plane and the soft laughter from front. Her call button blinked one more time before abruptly switching off, manually canceled by someone who hadn't even spoken to her. Olivia stared at the panel light above, then let her gaze drift forward, past the curtain to the galley where the crew was now gathered, joking, sipping from their cups. She caught sight of the same blonde attendant from earlier. The woman was laughing now, her hand over her mouth, nodding at something the male attendant whispered to her. They looked her way once, briefly, then turned away again. A simmer stirred behind Olivia's composed face. She knew this choreography. She knew it from restaurants, from receptions, from boardrooms where she was always first mistaken for someone's assistant. She didn't need to be shouted at to know she wasn't wanted. The performance of indifference spoke volumes. And yet, despite the cool air of exclusion, she remained composed. A lesser presence might have recoiled. Olivia leaned back and crossed her legs, her posture regal, her focus narrowing in. She wasn't going to play the victim. She was going to play the observer. Because this wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a case study, a live session in subtle power dynamics. From her periphery, she noticed another woman 2 rows ahead, white mid-40s, with a crisp scarf and a designer tote. The woman turned in her seat, gave Olivia a long, evaluative look, then turned away with a faint shake of her head. Olivia smiled faintly. She wasn't surprised. The message from the cabin was clear. You are tolerated. You are not welcomed. Her seatmate leaned toward her slightly, the edge of his voice low, but clearly intended to land. You know, he said, they really ought to keep this section consistent. Otherwise, the whole experience changes. A flight attendant, not one she had seen before, a tall man with buzzed hair and a brisk walk, swept down the aisle conducting a cursory check of overhead bins and loose items. Without a word, he stopped beside her row and pointed at her designer tote, which rested neatly beneath the seat in front of her. His fingers, clad in latex, gloves more suited for a hazmat drill than beverage service, pinched the handle between two fingers like it was dripping something offensive. Olivia's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in shock, but in acknowledgement. Here came another layer. The man didn't ask for permission. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply picked up her bag with the same expression someone might wear while removing spoiled food from a fridge. Then, with a thud louder than necessary, he dropped it on the empty seat across the aisle. No explanation followed. He moved on, leaving behind a moment that echoed louder than any insult. Olivia stared at the bag, then turned slowly to watch him walk away. She reached over, collected it, and placed it back where it belonged. As she settled it gently beneath her seat, she heard the soft flutter of laughter drift forward from the galley curtain. It was the same group she'd observed earlier, now gathered again, blonde, brunette, buzz-cut, all clustered like teenagers passing notes. One of them, the blonde from boarding, tilted her phone screen just enough for the others to see. Olivia caught the faint glow of an image being shared. The others leaned in, smirks rising like smoke. She couldn't see what was on the screen, but she didn't have to. She knew. It was the notebook. Her notebook. The one she'd had in her lap earlier, pages full of lecture notes, references, and historical data points. And someone, one of them, had decided it was funny, had taken a photo without consent, had turned her work, her tool, her voice, into a joke. Olivia's jaw set, her posture unflinching, her gaze fixed now on the back of the galley curtain like it was a stage curtain about to rise. Behind her, a passenger whispered, "Is she seriously writing a diary in first class?" Another chuckled. "Maybe she's journaling her upgrade experience." The words weren't loud, but they were aimed. Olivia didn't flinch. She didn't give them the gift of reaction. Instead, she returned to her notebook, her pen slow, methodical, each stroke deliberate. Across the top of the page, she wrote, "Humiliation by performance when exclusion isn't enough." She paused, then underlined it twice. The pen ink glistened for a moment before drying. She glanced again toward the galley. They were still laughing. The blonde leaned back against the counter now, twirling her lanyard, her voice barely audible but distinctly smug. "I swear, she brought that thing like she's grading papers on a greyhound." The man beside her snorted, nearly spilling his coffee. The brunette nudged him, whispering something that made them both cackle again. Olivia closed her notebook. Slowly, carefully. Her hand hovered over the clasp for a moment longer than necessary before she slid it into her briefcase and shut it tight. She looked forward, then back, scanning the cabin. Most passengers were engaged in their screens, their drinks, their soft luxuries. But a few had noticed the exchange, noticed her. One man 2 rows up made brief eye contact before quickly looking away. A woman beside him in pearls and navy gave Olivia a once-over before lifting her glass with theatrical disinterest. Olivia exhaled slowly through her nose, grounding herself, calming her heartbeat. This was no longer mere rudeness. It had shifted into something intentional, targeted, coordinated. They were trying to push her out, not physically, but emotionally. Push her back into silence, into invisibility. She'd seen it before, in meetings where her ideas were credited to someone else, at donor galas where she was asked to wear a server's badge, and now here, above 30,000 feet, where the altitude didn't thin out the prejudice. It only gave it room to rise. Olivia's expression remained serene, but her mind moved with cutting clarity. Every insult, every whisper, every violation, they weren't just incidents. They were data points. And she had been collecting them. Not for revenge, for reckoning. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. No photos, no videos, just a single text message, drafted but unsent. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a rumpled but clearly expensive linen suit, and wore an expression that said he was used to getting what he wanted. The flight attendant sprang into motion the moment he entered the cabin. The brunette rushed to greet him with an apology already forming, her voice hushed but urgent. Olivia noticed the immediate shift in tone, the way urgency suddenly replaced routine. The man murmured something, gestured vaguely toward the seating chart, then pointed down the aisle, right at Olivia's row. A few seats were empty in business class, but that wasn't the plan. He wanted her seat. Within seconds, the blonde attendant reappeared, this time with faux sweetness dripping from her tone. "Ma'am," she began, leaning in just enough to invade personal space, "we're in a bit of situation. We've had an unexpected arrival, a priority passenger, and we'll need to reseat you temporarily." Olivia didn't blink. "I'm sorry," she replied evenly, "but this is my assigned seat." "Yes, absolutely," the attendant replied too quickly. "And we deeply apologize, but we'd really appreciate your cooperation for just this portion of the flight." "No," Olivia said, her voice calm, firm, and final. "This is 2A. It's printed on my boarding pass. It's already been scanned and confirmed." The attendant faltered slightly, smile tightening into a strain. "It's just he's an executive partner with our corporate account, and we're trying to manage things delicately." "Delicately," Olivia repeated. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. She simply held her gaze steady and waited. Silence blossomed between them, sharp and uncomfortable. The man now stood 2 rows back, arms crossed, eyes locked on Olivia like she was a child refusing to share a toy. Other passengers sensed the standoff. One by one, heads began to turn. The woman in pearls lifted her sunglasses slightly. The man in 3C leaned forward, brow raised. Olivia could feel the air thicken with the pressure of performance. The crew hadn't expected pushback. They certainly hadn't expected it from her. And yet here she was, unmoving, unimpressed, and unmistakably in control. The blonde cleared her throat. "It's just for this flight segment," she offered again, the sweetness draining from her voice. "He'll only need it until we reach our cruising altitude, and then he can wait," Olivia interrupted, her voice like polished glass. The attendant blinked, surprised. The man behind her muttered something about people not understanding how business travel works. Olivia turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I understand perfectly," she said. "I paid for this seat. I boarded on time. I followed every rule your airline created. And now you want to rewrite them. Midair for someone who showed up late." The murmurs in the cabin deepened. Even the man in 4B, who hadn't looked up since takeoff, slowly removed his headphones. The brunette flight attendant appeared again, joining the blonde like backup. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body language said enough. Arms crossed, weight shifted, chin lifted in judgment. Then came the final blow, the smallest movement, a simple gesture, but it landed like a slap. The brunette looked down at Olivia's lap, at her notebook closed but visible, and shook her head slowly, just once, with a soft, disbelieving smirk. It wasn't just disapproval. It was condescension. It was dismissal. Olivia didn't move. She didn't react. Her silence said more than outrage ever could. She reached into her blazer pocket, retrieved her boarding pass, and laid it flat on her tray table. "This is mine," she said, not to the attendants, not to the passengers, but to the moment. Her presence declared what no one else seemed willing to admit, that her dignity wasn't optional, that her seat wasn't negotiable, and that their discomfort wasn't her responsibility. The attendants hesitated, caught between policy and power. And then, as quickly as it started, the tension began to dissipate, not because they relented, but because Olivia refused to. The attendants no longer spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Their words clipped, their eyes avoiding hers like she had committed some silent violation of the unspoken social hierarchy. The consequences came quickly, beginning with something as simple as a drink. 35 minutes had passed since beverage service began in first class. Olivia had now been overlooked not once, not twice, but 3 times. She had pressed the call button after the second pass, a quiet request for water. Nothing more, but no one responded. The light blinked for 7 full minutes before going dark on its own, canceled by someone who never arrived. The passengers beside and behind her had long since been served, their glasses clinking softly as they sipped wine or sparkling water, accompanied by slices of lemon or mint leaves. Olivia sat with an empty tray and dry mouth, the absence of attention louder than any insult. When a fourth attendant, this one a young man with an eager gait, pushed the cart down the aisle, she made eye contact and gave a polite nod. He paused at 2B, poured another drink, smiled, and then, without so much as a glance at her, moved on. Olivia sat still, watching the cart disappear down the aisle, her fingers resting lightly on the closed notebook in her lap. She didn't ask again. She simply noted the timing on her phone. 12:47 p.m., third denial of basic service. Moments later, a soft rustling sound broke her focus. The man in 3C had stood up to stretch, and as he adjusted himself in the narrow aisle, his foot, careless or calculated, caught the edge of Olivia's tray. The newspaper she had placed there earlier for reading slid off and fluttered to the floor, landing between her feet. The man glanced down, paused for a heartbeat, then turned and walked toward the restroom without a word. Another passenger across the aisle glanced at the fallen paper, looked at Olivia, then quickly looked away. Olivia didn't reach down immediately. She simply sat still, back straight, expression unreadable, letting the newspaper lie there like evidence. After a long pause, she leaned forward, picked it up, smoothed the creases slowly, and folded it into a neat square. She placed it beside her and resumed her seat, her breath even, her presence unmoved. Around her, the soft murmur of the cabin continued, but a chill had settled in the air. From the galley, she could hear muffled voices, laughter, footsteps, a soda can cracking open, but none of it came her way. It was as if she no longer existed, or worse, as if she existed solely as a test, a provocation, a subject to be examined, resisted, dismissed. And yet, Olivia refused to be erased. She refused to shrink. She reached again for her notebook and scribbled the next line in bold ink. Exclusion escalates when quiet resistance is mistaken for weakness. Just as she wrote the final word, the curtain to the galley parted once more. The blonde attendant appeared, walking briskly and carrying a tray with a single covered dish. She moved past Olivia without a glance, paused at 1A, then leaned down and spoke in hushed tones to the passenger there. Olivia couldn't hear the words, but she caught the tone, friendly, intimate, the kind reserved for regulars and favored guests. After delivering the meal, the attendant turned and headed back, passing Olivia's row again. As she did, her eyes flicked toward Olivia's tray table, then away, as if seeing it would somehow obligate her to acknowledge it. But she didn't stop. She didn't ask. She didn't offer anything. Olivia's tray remained empty. Her dignity, however, did not. A new round of service began, pillows distributed, headphones handed out, light blankets folded neatly on laps across the cabin, and once again, Olivia's row was bypassed. The male attendant who moved swiftly down the aisle carried a stack of noise-canceling headphones and soft fleece throws, his smile automatic as he nodded at each passenger, asking if they needed anything else. When he reached 2B, Olivia's seatmate received both items with a satisfied nod. The attendant looked directly over Olivia's head as if she wasn't there, then continued to 3A without hesitation. Olivia sat still, her hands on her lap, her expression perfectly neutral, but the message had landed. Again, she waited until he returned up the aisle, then raised her hand and spoke in a clear, calm voice. "Excuse me, may I have a blanket and headphones as well?" The man paused, turned slightly, and replied with an indifferent tone, "We're out up here. If you'd like, you can request one from the flight team in the rear cabin." Then he moved on, without waiting for her response. Olivia lowered her hand slowly, blinking once. The passenger across from her, a middle-aged white woman with a platinum bob and diamond studs, glanced over her shoulder at Olivia, then leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her hand. A few moments later, the woman unbuckled her belt and stood up. With a pointed glance, she turned and walked toward the flight attendant in the galley, spoke briefly, and then returned. Moments after, a seat switch occurred. The woman traded places with a younger woman seated a few rows back. As the new passenger settled in, she gave Olivia a polite nod, the kind reserved for strangers you don't wish to engage with. Olivia returned it, her smile small but controlled, and resumed her stillness. She didn't need to hear the whispered reason. She already knew. It was written in the arch of the eyebrow, the purse of the lips, the quick glance that screamed, "I don't want to sit near her." This was no longer passive discomfort. It was active rejection. And yet, despite every inch of space growing colder and more hostile, Olivia remained unshaken. She adjusted her seat, pulled her blazer tighter around her shoulders, and focused on her breathing. Across the aisle, passengers reclined their chairs, pulled blankets to their chins, and lowered eye masks. The environment shifted into nighttime mode. For Olivia, no such comfort arrived. Her seat lacked the very basics now. No warmth, no noise relief, no acknowledgement. The shadows lengthened across the cabin ceiling. Somewhere behind the curtain, the crew laughed softly, their voices muffled but animated. No one returned to her row. No one asked if she needed anything. She wasn't invisible, but she was being made to feel unwelcome. Deliberately, strategically. Around her, first class carried on like a well-oiled machine of luxury and convenience, all while treating her presence as a disruption to its rhythm. Olivia opened her notebook again. Her handwriting was sharper now, her pen strokes more exact. Cultural exclusion doesn't require laws. It only needs silence, repetition, and complicity. She tapped the page once with the pen and stared at the words for a long moment, letting them settle. The cabin lights shifted to a soft blue. A gentle announcement echoed from the speakers. Meal service would begin in 20 minutes. Olivia didn't expect to be asked for her choice. And she was right. When the menu cards came around, her row was skipped entirely. Not even a printed copy left on her tray. She waited. She watched. She learned. At this altitude, the game wasn't just about discomfort. It was about establishing hierarchy, making sure someone knew where they stood, and that someone was her. Yet through every ignored request, every skipped gesture of hospitality, Olivia sharpened her resolve. She wasn't on that plane for their approval. She wasn't interested in their permission to belong. She had been collecting proof. And now, at 32,000 feet above the ground, while the rest of the cabin sank into the luxury of curated ignorance, she stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just with purpose, unbothered by the weight of eyes that had already judged her, dismissed her, discarded her. She took a moment to adjust the lapel of her blazer, stepped quietly into the aisle, and walked past the curtained galley. A few heads turned, confused or annoyed. One of the flight attendants noticed her movement, started to speak, but fell silent when Olivia raised a single hand. Not a warning, but a statement. Do not interfere. She stopped near the cockpit bulkhead, directly beneath the overhead crew monitor panel, where the names of staff and flight status rotated every few minutes. From her inside coat pocket, she retrieved her phone. She didn't scroll, didn't pause. She opened a secured app, tapped once, and typed 4 words. Activate ID level 5. Then she pressed send. Less than 5 seconds later, the internal security feed behind the galley flickered. A blue screen replaced the rotating staff manifest. The air around the front of the cabin shifted. Olivia stepped aside as the screen displayed a government-grade ID badge. Her name appeared in bold white letters against a Department of Education crest, flanked by a federal eagle and a biometric code. Underneath it read, Dr. Olivia Morgan, Senior Director, National Cultural Grant Initiative Clearance Level 5. The screen pulsed with authority. It wasn't just an identity. It was a reckoning. The blonde attendant, who had so callously dismissed her earlier, emerged from the galley carrying a cup of tea, presumably for another guest. only to stop mid-step as she noticed the monitor. The color drained from her face. Behind her, the brunette followed, whispering something until she too saw the screen and froze. Olivia turned to face them, not with smugness, but with absolute clarity. "You've had multiple opportunities to do the right thing," she said, her voice quiet, level, and indisputably in command. "Now I suggest you inform your captain that this flight is under review." The blonde stammered, I didn't realize you didn't ask," Olivia interrupted, not cruelly, just truthfully. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" The brunette looked at the floor, murmuring, "We were just following protocol." Olivia didn't blink. "Then it's time you revise your protocol." The cockpit door opened a few inches. A tall man with silver epaulets and a tight jawline leaned out, confusion etched on his face. "Is there an issue here?" Olivia glanced at the monitor, still glowing, behind her, then at him. "I need a secure line to ground operations immediately." He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He stepped back, held the door open, and nodded once. "Right this way, ma'am." The cabin behind her had shifted entirely. First-class passengers who had ignored her now craned their necks to see. Some pulled off headphones. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Her seatmate, who hadn't spoken to her since boarding, now leaned into the aisle, his brow furrowed in disbelief. As Olivia disappeared into the cockpit, the ripple of awareness grew louder. She wasn't just a woman in first class. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the person whose signature could approve or eliminate funding for the airline's educational partnerships, cultural training contracts, and federal compliance programs. In short, she wasn't powerless. She was pivotal. And now everyone knew. Behind the scenes, the secure message she'd sent had already triggered an internal review alert within the airline's parent company. At the federal level, her clearance meant that every part of the flight, including internal communications, crew manifests, and passenger interactions, would be documented, reviewed, and subject to immediate audit. The crew had gone from smug to stunned in less than 60 seconds. Olivia didn't revel in their panic. That wasn't the point. She hadn't stood up to embarrass anyone. She'd stood up because they'd made her feel invisible, and she needed them to understand the weight of what they had chosen to ignore. When she exited the cockpit 15 minutes later, the captain escorted her back personally. The crew cleared the aisle like she was royalty. Passengers who once whispered judgments now stared blankly ahead, afraid that any acknowledgement might implicate them in what they had just witnessed. Flight attendants scurried about with forced smiles and trembling hands, trying to undo what could no longer be buried. The illusion of professionalism had collapsed under the weight of truth. And truth, now that it had a name and a title, demanded action. Olivia sat with the composure of a judge presiding over a courtroom, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the meal tray they had so hurriedly prepared an apology. Her food remained untouched. Her appetite had never returned. Across the cabin, a subtle chime echoed through the crew communication system. It was not the usual in-flight alert. It carried a different tone, deeper coded. Within seconds, the cockpit door opened again. This time, the first officer stepped out, not with confusion, but with formality. He approached the lead flight attendant and whispered something too softly to hear. The blonde's eyes widened. The brunette behind her paled visibly. Then came the command, delivered without drama, but with finality. Captain would like all cabin crew to clear the first-class section until further notice. Gasps didn't follow, but the silence that replaced them spoke louder. One by one, the attendants filed out of the cabin, heads lowered, eyes averted. No trays, no service, no noise. Just a long, shamed procession of authority stripped bare. Olivia didn't look at them as they passed. She didn't need to. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Behind them, the curtain was drawn, not for privacy, but for separation. And behind that curtain, a message was being delivered to every level of the airline's internal command system. On the cockpit's main operations screen, a red banner blinked to life. It read, "Urgent, Federal Contract Status Update." Below it, in bold letters, the message continued. $1.6 billion national education and inclusion grant status. Canceled effective immediately. The impact of those words couldn't be measured in sound, but it was felt in every department across the airline's operations grid. In real time, alerts triggered system-wide notifications. Legal, finance, executive relations, corporate compliance. All eyes turned to Flight 370. And at the center of it all, in Seat 2A, sat the woman they had ignored, dismissed, and nearly erased. The irony cut deep. A team trained to recognize VIP passengers had failed to see the most important one aboard. Not because she was hidden, but because their eyes were trained to search for wealth in skin tone, not substance. They had bet everything on a stereotype, and they lost. Back in the main cabin, the mood shifted. The murmurs started slowly, first from the businessman in 4A, then from a couple in 3B. "Did you see that ID screen?" one whispered. "She's with the Federal Education Board, like the top level," said another. "They kicked her out over nothing," a woman muttered from 5D, shaking her head. "That's why we're in trouble now." The story was already spreading like cabin pressure, tightening around everyone who had seen what happened and said nothing. Even those who hadn't participated now felt complicit, because silence was never neutral. Olivia remained composed, unmoved by the chaos she had triggered. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence had become the loudest voice in the cabin. The captain himself emerged one final time, walking down the aisle with careful steps. He paused at Olivia's seat, removed his cap, and bowed his head slightly. "On behalf of the airline," he said, voice low and sincere, "we offer our deepest apologies." Olivia nodded once, her eyes never leaving his. "Thank you, Captain," she replied. "See that it doesn't happen again." And with that, she returned to her seat, unfolded her tray table, and finally took a sip of water. It started with a leak. Not from Olivia, who had remained silent through the rest of the journey, composed even as she disembarked ahead of everyone, her heels clicking calmly across the jet bridge while the crew stood frozen in the galley, eyes downcast, unsure whether to speak or vanish. No, the leak came from someone inside. A junior staff member, likely one who had watched the whole situation unfold in quiet horror, released a series of screenshots to an anonymous aviation forum. Within minutes, the content spread across platforms, Twitter, Reddit, LinkedIn, each one amplifying the same message. This wasn't just a mistake. This was systemic. The screenshots showed an internal chat log labeled First Class Team Flight 370. The messages were damning. "She's probably some community college adjunct trying to play Harvard. Bet that notebook is full of quotes from Oprah. Upgrade or infiltration. LMAO. She's in 2A looking like she borrowed that blazer from a donation bin." The timestamps aligned exactly with the moments Olivia had been denied water, skipped for service, and publicly asked to move seats. The backlash was immediate. Media outlets picked up the story and ran it under headlines like "High Altitude, Low Decency," and "Airline Faces Firestorm After Disrespecting Black Federal Official." News anchors debated it on live TV. Advocacy groups demanded resignations. Civil rights attorneys drafted formal inquiries. But it wasn't just the public who responded, it was the investors. Within 24 hours, the airline's parent company stock dropped nearly 7%. By the 48th hour, two major institutional investors had announced divestment citing ethical misalignment and irreparable reputational damage. The corporate office went into crisis mode. The CEO, once a media darling known for boasting about inclusive innovation, was forced to cancel a major tech summit appearance and return from Switzerland to face a board meeting that had turned into an emergency tribunal. Olivia's name was everywhere by then, not because she had chased attention, but because the truth she carried was impossible to ignore once exposed. And yet, even as her title trended on news feeds and reporters camped outside federal buildings, Olivia herself issued no statement. She let the facts speak. The receipts, the chat logs, the silence of those who had stood by. The panic inside the airline grew. Employees were called into mandatory cultural sensitivity training, but that wasn't enough. Protesters stood outside the corporate headquarters with signs that read, "Respect is not first class only." And what seat did you steal today? Internally, a deeper audit began. Human Resources opened files on every member of the Flight 370 crew. Complaints emerged, not just from Olivia's flight, but from dozens of others who had flown before her and had been quietly mistreated, dismissed, degraded. One report described a nearly identical situation with a black entrepreneur from Texas who had been asked to show ID twice for boarding. Another detailed a Latina professor who had been denied wine service until a white passenger vouched for her. The culture of the airline, once painted in PR as forward-thinking, was now exposed as a mosaic of discrimination wrapped in corporate polish. Olivia watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't tweet. She didn't go on TV. She stayed focused on her work, reviewing grant applications, conducting outreach, mentoring new scholars. But she also didn't stay silent. When asked by a civil rights coalition whether she wanted to press charges, she declined. "Not yet," she said. "The damage they've done is speaking louder than anything I could add." But behind the scenes, her office quietly severed multiple contracts, partnerships, PR campaigns, educational initiatives, all gone, with one signature. Meanwhile, inside the airline C-suite, the CEO stood before the board, reading aloud an apology letter meant for public release. "We are deeply sorry," it began, "for the pain and harm caused to Dr. Olivia Morgan and to every passenger who has felt unseen or devalued aboard our aircraft." But words could not undo what action had already carved into stone. 2 weeks after the scandal had detonated through newsrooms and boardrooms alike, when the headlines had begun to quiet, but the consequences still rang through shareholder calls and public statements, a quiet knock came to the door of Olivia's Washington, D.C. office. It wasn't unusual for people to seek her out in the days that followed. Journalists hoping for interviews, politicians requesting comment, even other victims reaching out to say, "You gave me the courage to speak." But this knock was different. It was tentative, soft, the kind of knock that carried the weight of shame more than ambition. Olivia looked up from a folder of grant proposals and called, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and a young woman stepped inside, nervous, clutching a soft-bound notebook and a neatly folded piece of paper. It was the junior flight attendant from Flight 370. Olivia remembered her, not for what she had said, but for what she hadn't. She hadn't laughed with the others, but she hadn't stopped them either. She had watched. That alone had placed her somewhere between silent witness and reluctant participant. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she approached. "Dr. Morgan," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to apologize." Olivia gestured to the chair across from her. "Go on." The young woman sat, unfolded the letter, and read from it with a voice cracked by regret. She admitted to seeing what happened, to understanding it was wrong, to being afraid to speak up in the moment. She admitted that silence is a choice, and that her silence had made her complicit. Olivia listened without interruption, her expression calm but unreadable. When the letter ended, the woman placed it on the desk along with the notebook, a blank one, meant not for grading but for learning. "I want to do better," she said. "I've already resigned, but I want to understand. And I want to start somewhere that doesn't erase what happened, but teaches me how to never let it happen again." Olivia leaned back in her chair and regarded her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "We have a 6-month program," she said, sliding open a drawer and retrieving a pamphlet. "It's a fellowship in cultural literacy and racial equity. You'll study history, law, ethics. You'll volunteer with underserved communities. You'll listen more than you speak. You'll learn to recognize power, not just who holds it, but who it's been taken from." The woman nodded quickly, accepting the pamphlet with both hands. "I'll do it." "It won't be easy," Olivia warned. "Growth never is." But there was no scorn in her tone, only resolve, and maybe, just barely, a sliver of hope. Outside the office, the world had already begun to shift. The airline, desperate to repair its image, had launched an internal campaign to rebuild from within. Not the kind that hides behind PR, but one that Olivia herself was invited to consult on. She had declined the contract, but accepted a single condition: mandatory immersive education for all crew and management, built by independent civil rights educators, audited annually, funded directly from executive bonuses. The board had no choice but to agree. In the months that followed, dozens of crew members signed up, some out of pressure, some out of guilt, but a few, like the young woman across from her now, came out of conviction. Olivia didn't see herself as a hero. She never had. Heroes ask for applause. She had asked only for dignity. And when it was denied, she did what history had taught her to do. She turned indignity into action. By the end of that year, reports showed a sharp drop in customer complaints related to discrimination aboard that airline. Independent audits found improved retention among diverse staff, better representation in leadership, and a noticeable culture shift in cabin crews. The work was far from done, but something had begun, and it began with one voice that refused to stay silent, one seat that refused to be surrendered, one woman who refused to be erased. Olivia closed the file in front of her and stood, walking the young woman to the door. "I look forward to your first report," she said. The woman nodded, eyes clear now, grip firm around the notebook. As she left, Olivia returned to her desk, sunlight casting long lines across the polished floor. Justice didn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walked in quietly, opened a notebook, and began again. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful chapter. Which moment hit you the hardest? And what would you have done in Olivia's place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? We'd love to hear from you.